All right, so just to kind of touch up on a few more React specific items. So before lunch, we broke up some functionality into mybutton.js, which is my button component, and my label component, which are just functional components that are child components of our parent app component. So again, we have our app component, which renders a my button component and my label component. As we talked about earlier, one benefit of using components is the reusability it offers. So I'm going to make actually a couple minor changes just to see what we can do with our components that we have now. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a few more buttons. So again, that reusability, I'm just going to copy my button component that I had here and create another instance of it. So again, similar to our OOP discussions, hopefully OOP is still fresh in your mind. But my button is essentially is like, you can think of it as a template, and then we're creating various instances of it each time we kind of declare it like this. So we have two buttons now here. Let's say we want to customize it. So our first one can say click me, because we have that customization. Our second one say push me. Our third one can say, hit me, whatever we want to say. So now we have three instances. And the way this is set up right now is that all three buttons will call the same handler, button handler, right? So increment counter will be called by each one of these buttons, so that if I click any of these three buttons, my label should update for any of those three, because the counter will be incremented regardless of which button I hit. So let's actually take a look at this. If I save this and go back to my window, notice I have three buttons now. I have a click me, push me, hit me, but all of them should update this item. Sorry, I want to refresh, set that to 0. So now let's say I click me, notice we update, push me, hit me. Again, we click any of these, our label updates, because that's the way we've designed this. Again, some reusability here. Again, this button, it's the same button component. It just has some customization based on the props that we pass down to it. Otherwise, like the functionality is the same for each of these buttons, right? So that's one great feature of React. It just makes it really easy to reuse components. And that's why you want to break it down into smaller components so they can reuse pieces, right, without having to reuse like the whole pizza or the whole pie of things. Let's kind of modify.
So I have a question, Ankur.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to have a different button with a different functionality, would that be a separate component, or do you modify this component with something? Or
yeah, if you wanted a different a button to maybe like instead of incrementing a counter to like show an alert box, yeah, that would likely be a different component, even though they're both like buttons. Like again, I call them my button, but whatever I put in here can be customized where I want it. It doesn't have to be a button. This could be anything I want it to be. My naming convention is just to identify that's still a button under the hood. Yeah, you want to create separate components for each functional piece that you want to add to your application.
Well, hold on. So just that button, you can have that button do whatever you want. So you can have it increment something, a counter, or you can have an alert box. It just depends on what props is passed in. That's why React is so great, is because you can create one button component, and you can also pass in props to make it look like something else.
Yeah, so let's actually go with that example. What if I just add another event handler that says show alerts instead of increment counter? So we're gonna pop up an alert box, alerts. Again, we could do this inside of our button component because the alert functionality should exist. But we just show an alert saying button was clicked. All right, so again, this is just a function. We could pass that into one of our buttons if we wanted to. So instead of passing an increment counter for my push me button, I'll just pass in show alert. All right, so this time when this button gets clicked, instead of incrementing my counter, it'll show an alert, right? So it's all customized, like the props make it so that we can customize what we actually want the props to do. So if I do it this way, my push me, so if I do, click me and hit me, those will increment the counter. But if I hit push me now, since we wired up another handler instead of the increment counter, if I hit push me, I just get a pop-up saying the button was clicked, but my increment or my label never incremented because the counter never changed, right?
Okay, so you don't need like a whole entirely different component.
Well, again, it depends what you need to achieve. So like this my button component currently has functionality so that we can control what reacts to the click and also what title we have it, right? If we wanted to add more, like maybe change the color of the button, we could add that to my button. But also, if that's special functionality, it's probably better to create like a new component called color button and do the function there. So again, same ideas with classes. Your classes should be specialized. You don't want to, you don't want to do like 50,000 different things in one class. You want to break them apart into like, okay, we have a student object, a person object, a staff object, because they all have unique capabilities or functionality or attributes, whatever you want to put in there. Yeah, so again, it's a design decision. Again, I could kind of shoehorn a color in here if I think that might be reusable, or I might just make a different component if I think that's a specialized component that might, kind of be out of my purview for my button. Yep, great question.
I have a question.
Yep.
Are your event handlers always going to go in the app.js file, or do they go inside your components like my button or my label?
Well, it depends. These handlers are in, so this alert was a bad example because this is not specific to my app. So I'm going to just get rid of it if we can backtrack a little bit. In this case, my increment counter has to be in my app because we are updating a state value via this function. So this counter is what's being updated by increment counter. So increment counter should exist in my app function. I can't call set counter directly from my button because my button has no knowledge of that state value, right? My button is agnostic of that. Again, that's the whole design we've come up with. This is proper design. My button doesn't care about that counter value. All my button cares about is notifying my parent that the button was clicked. It's the parent that's reacting and specifically updating our counter. It depends, again, what you're trying to do. So in this case, if I didn't want to call the parent, yeah, like I have my own handler here. Technically speaking, just to kind of point this out, I could call handle props, what is it, props dot handle click directly here, and not even have this handler here. So now whenever I click my button, it's going to directly call that props reference and call that function my parent. But the reason I added this handler here is because I wanted to do some additional thing of printing out to the console in addition to calling the props that was passed here. But yeah, again, you don't have to, you will place your handlers depending on what functionality they have to do. Usually speaking, they'll be in the same component, but sometimes you need to call up to a parent, and this is the design you'll see repeatedly, where the parent passes down a function reference, the child will call that function reference to kind of communicate with the parent. Otherwise, there's no direct communication between parent and child, or I guess from the child to the parent. Parents, again, can pass down props to a child, but a child can't like pass props up to a parent automatically. That's why we create handlers like this, where if we needed to pass a value, we could pass like my value here, and the parent can take in a value and do something with it. In this case, there's no value we care about. So yeah. All right, I'm going to change our design a little bit just to show a little bit more about components and the reusability. I'm going to create a brand new component, and let's call that my, let's call it clicky thing. All right, not a great name, but that's what I'm going with. So you guys will have to live with it. This will be a function component. So I'm going to call it clicky thing. It will take in some props likely. And this will return some JSX. One thing I want to point out here, just to point out more things, return, we're adding these parentheses here. The reason is because we usually have multi-lines for our return. Usually when we return something like return, a value of like 7, this works. But if we have 7 on a new line, notice it's grayed out because the return statement does not expect anything after it. That's why we add these parentheses, because we're kind of going to group everything after this into one return statement. So that's why we will normally be saying parentheses with our JSX. But again, this is a normal return statement. Just know that you need to use parentheses if you have multiple lines in your return statement. Again, those lines are purely cosmetic. JavaScript doesn't care about new lines. It's not Python where new lines actually matter. We're just creating new lines for readability. So here, I'm going to return a div.
Question.
Yep.
Can you specify when you should use a fat arrow function and then just like a regular function called, or does it not matter?
It does matter. I don't want to quite get into that today because it's a little more complicated. For now, just always tend to go with fat arrow functions inside your functional components. Notice here, I did not use a fat arrow function. I probably could, like pretty simple to change it to it. But yeah, sorry, I'm gonna punt on the answer just because it gets a little more
Oh yeah,
wants
please
and one with it.
punt away. I don't want to confuse us.
No, it's a great question though. It is relevant. There's a reason why we use fat arrow functions, but we gotta kind of talk about that a little more in detail. But yes, just to kind of touch upon that, when you have event handlers, you generally want to use fat arrow functions. But the reasoning a little more detailed. All right, so I'm actually going to return my button. Actually, I'm just going to copy what I had. So app.js, I'm going to copy what I had here and drop that into my clicky thing components. All right, so I'm going to take away one. So now I just have one my button, one my label. So now I've created a component that kind of houses both of these together. And now you might be wondering, why am I doing this? Well, hopefully we kind of see the benefit in like 2 minutes or less than that. So in order to use these values, I need to import them just like before. So I'll do import my button. All right, VS Code kind of auto-filled it for me. Thank you. And import my label. All right, so again, just to reiterate what I'm doing, I created a new component called clicky thing, and I'm importing my button and my label within that so that I can kind of nest them within my clicky thing. It's essentially just another layer between app and these components. And I want to export this. Don't forget that, easy to forget. Export default clicky thing. All right, so now that I have this component that kind of bundles my button, my label together, this will allow me to reuse this if I want multiple instances of kind of this functionality that I had before, right? So if I go back to my app.js, I'm going to get rid of these imports. Instead, I'm going to import clicky thing from components.clicky thing. And then I'm just going to render one clicky thing right here. Clicky thing takes in, let's see. All right, I need to move my state values also and go down to clicky thing. So basically everything I had in app.js, I just moved down to a new component called clicky thing. All right, so my state value got moved to my new component and my event handler for the button click. Add it down there. And then my app.js is simply going to render clicky thing instance. All right, so I have one clicky thing component that I'm rendering with my app. This should not change anything that we saw before. Going back to the previous example, not with 3 buttons, but this should still work as normal. I'm not sure what this error is about, but it might just be naming. Refresh. Let's take a look. Use state not defined. Yep, forgot my imports. So use state need to go down to the thing. Okay, I think we should get to go. I want to make sure I'm not going too quickly. Is everyone with me here? What I just did? Again, essentially everything that was in app.js, I moved into a new component called clicky thing, and everything I just kind of copied it and put it in here. In my app.js, now I'm using clicky thing and rendering one instance of it. So if I do this, and my button has an error. So again, get familiar. React kind of shows you errors, so it's kind of like Django. Kind of shows you what error, so it's kind of nice. So on button clicks not defined, likely an issue that I did here on button clicks. There we go. I always forget my endings there. All right, so save that. I think we should get. All right, we're back to where we were before, right? I could click this button, we increment.
Real quick, Ankur, I'm not sure if it was just me, but like I think I got lost in the sauce right now.
Sure.
Can you just show us what you moved where one more time, please?
Yeah, so everything I had in app.js. If we remember, app.js used to look like this. This is my previous app.js, where we had a state value, we had a increment counter event handler, which will basically update our counter, and then we had a div that rendered a my button and my label component. So I just took everything we had previously in my app component, cut it out there, put it in my new component. So it looks essentially like it did before, except it's now under clicky thing instead of app. Nothing else has changed there. All right, now I went back to my app.js. I imported my new component that I just created. It's that new parent component that's sitting between app and my button, my label. And in here, I'm going to return a div. And inside of the div, I'll return a clicky thing. Jonathan, was there anything that you're still lost in the sauce with? Again, I didn't mean to lose anyone.
Possibly. Let me see right now. I'm gonna type in a clicky thing and see if it looks like
Yeah,
yours
so
or not.
if you made this transition correctly, you should not notice anything different from what we had before, except it looks like these kind of moved over. Oh,
So it's a safe assumption that my fail to compile means that there's something incorrect.
Yeah, it's probably likely. What was the name of this class?
The class was named app.
Thank you. Yeah, that applies to CSS, which we're looking for. So recenter it again. All right, so again, this clicking works. The whole reason I did this was to add reusability. So if I go to my app, and what if I want multiple clicky things? Well, all I gotta do is copy and paste a few of them. Let's have 7 different ones. So now I could have 7 different instances of clicky thing. And they're all independent. So if I click this one, notice it's only updating this counter because they're all just internal to this clicky thing component. So you could have as many instances as you want. They act independently because they have their own internal state value of counter. They have their own label and button that work together. Does that make sense? So again, reusability. We create components so that we could create copies and independent instances if we need to reuse them over and over, rather than kind of coding them up repeatedly. What questions do you guys have about reusing components? Any of the redesign we did here? So does it make sense why we just kind of reuse something? Because again, everything's baked into clicky thing, so we could have multiple instances of them and totally works fine. Jonathan, are you still getting compile errors?
Yeah, can you go to your mybutton.js? Let me take a quick look.
If I can I go to your mybutton.js? I'm going to have you share.
Sure.
So again, good to look at some errors. Errors are common. It's fine. Just kind of let's make sure we understand how to read errors and how to fix them.
Let me move this stupid overlay here.
Okay, so looking at your terminal is showing you some errors. Do you see the error down there?
Sure.
Okay, so what do you think the resolution to that might be?
Use state is not defined.
Yep.
I guess I have to define a use state.
Yeah, so on line 6, you're using something called use state. However, this component does not know anything called use state. So you need to import use state, and this is something that comes from React. So when we went from app.js to clicky thing, we forgot to move over an import. I forgot to do it also. So if you go to your app.js file,
Okay.
and at the top, notice we have import use state from React on line 2. That's we don't need that in app.js anymore because we're not using use state. We just move that import into clicky thing. Yep. So let's see if that resolves that error. Okay, so now we're getting warnings, which is fine. So we don't have anything on your main page. Let's take a look at your app.js because your app.js is your top level node. So we have clicky thing. We're importing it. That looks correct. That looks correct. One thing is you might need to capitalize your clicky thing file. I think naming might matter for your file name. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think components might have to have a capitalization. Tom might be able to correct me on that. Click yes. Yep. All right. Let's see if that fixes it. Nope, nothing there.
Oh, no, it failed to compile.
Oh, we got an error message. What did it say? Click it thing.js does not match. So try refreshing your page, your browser page.
How do you refresh just Control R like a regular browser, or?
Just go to your browser and just refresh it.
Oh, I see.
No, your browser, not your.
Oh, my actual. Okay, not bad.
All right.
No,
For some reason, it does not seem to find it. Okay, can you go back to so your file is clicky.
It looked like I saw like a lowercase c on the clicky thing is on the error. So is there I don't know, I think you probably have a lowercase clicky thing somewhere that's incorrect.
Try killing your server and relaunching it. I'm not sure if VS Code's update and trickle to React. So hit Control C in your terminal and do an npm start again. I feel like
It's probably on
you
the export default, by the way. at the bottom of clicky thing. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, say again?
Clicky thing file on the very bottom in the clicky thing file. So go to the click, there you go, at the very bottom. Okay,
So
so
you
it
have,
should be working right now.
yeah, so notice that you have two return statements. So the bottom part is grayed out because one return is superseding the other. So you want to move that div stuff into your other return statement.
Wait, what? I guess.
Yep, that should work. But again, we need to return only one parent node. You're returning two divs. But as I mentioned earlier, you
Oh,
can
I
with
get it.
one top level div. Yep. So now you should be able to see something in your browser. In this case, you have 3 buttons. There we go. All right.
Okay.
So I'm going to take back control of the screen share if you don't mind.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your patience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Want to make sure everyone's kind of getting this. While we're kind of in this short break, does anyone have any code they want to throw up? Anyone having issues? Are you guys following along with the changes we're making? All right, I see a thumbs up, see 2 thumbs up. I'll take that as we're good to go. All right, let me know if the pace is too fast, but trying to keep it slow intentionally. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. Let's kind of continue on here. All right, so that kind of highlights reusability of components. Again, we can make this more granular if needed. We could have 50 different components and reuse them. Again, the nesting is kind of your design decisions. So there's going to be a hierarchy, right? So we have now our top level is app. Then we have clicky thing. Clicky thing further has more child components. So again, we have a grandparent of app, a parent of clicky thing, and grandchildren or children called my button, my label. Again, this can get very, very deep. So just know that there's no real limit to how nested this can get. It all comes down to what makes the most sense for your design. Michael Robertson?
You said like parent and child, but like clicky thing and my button are basically peers, right? In theory, you could be calling clicky thing from my button if you wanted to as well, right? It's not not in this case because you're already calling it, because then you get a circular. But is there anything that makes it hierarchical like you said it was, other than just the way that you have it typed?
Yeah, so let me clarify my statement a little bit. So when I say parent-child, this is different than parent-child inheritance. So my button is not inheriting from clicky thing. So I just want to make that distinction. We still use the terminology of parent and child node just because the child node is contained within this component, sorry, child component, parent component, but it's not the same as inheritance child parent. So make that distinction if you can.
Okay. Yeah, that clears me up.
It's more about ownership. Yeah. So my button is kind of owned by clicky thing. So we just say parent child. I know that's not a typical parent child relationship, but maybe there's some better terminology that can be used here. But I think parent and child are pretty common.
It's kind of like more HTML parent child.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's sort of like imagine a tree. So yeah, these are child nodes of this node. If you're imagining the tree structure. Okay, so that kind of covers again components. Hopefully, the design sort of coming to make sense. Again, you'll get much more practice with your challenges. It'll hopefully kind of click if it's not clicking right now why this design structure kind of exists. Okay, with that, we're going to make one last transition into class-based components. Now, as I mentioned, everything you could do in functional components, you could do in class components, vice versa. It's just different syntax to do the same exact thing. And it's kind of annoying, I admit, learning a new language or new framework, having to learn 2 different syntax to do the same thing. Again, we're going to focus on functional-based components, but class-based components are important to know also because they still exist out in the wild. Some people still develop with class-based components. You'll likely see it at some point, so it's kind of good to get familiar with it. All right, let me actually